120 seconds. That is all it took. 12 men against 43. And when the smoke cleared, not a single Australian had even a scratch on him. The Americans watching from the tree line could not believe their eyes. They had called in airstrikes that lasted hours and achieved less. They had sent entire platoons that stumbled through the jungle like blind elephants. And here were these sun-weathered farmers from Australia doing in 2 minutes what the mightiest military machine on Earth could not do in 2 days. So what the hell happened out there? The Pentagon buried this story for decades. And I am about to tell you why. You see, the Australian SAS operated by rules that made American commanders deeply uncomfortable. They moved like ghosts, they thought like predators, and they used methods so controversial that classified reports were locked away where nobody could find them. The Viet Cong had a name for these Australians, Ma Rung, the Phantoms of the Jungle. And when you hear what they did to earn that name, you will understand why the enemy preferred facing American firepower over these silent hunters. But here's the question nobody wants to answer. If the Australians were this good, why did the Americans refuse to learn from them? Why did the Pentagon bury reports showing their allies had a kill ratio 50 times higher than U.S. Special Forces? And what were these methods that were too disturbing to officially acknowledge? Stay with me until the end, because by the time this video is over, you will know exactly what the American military tried to hide. And trust me, what I am about to reveal will change everything you thought you knew about Vietnam. Let us begin. The jungle exploded in precisely 120 seconds of controlled violence. Not a single wasted bullet. Not a single unnecessary movement. 12 Australian SAS operators materialized from the green darkness like vengeful spirits, struck with surgical precision, and vanished before the smoke cleared. The American advisors watching from the tree line could not believe what they had just witnessed. They had called in artillery strikes that lasted hours and achieved less. They had deployed entire platoons that stumbled through the bush like drunken elephants. And here were these sun-weathered Australians accomplishing in 2 minutes what the mightiest military machine on Earth could not do in 2 days. This was not luck. This was not coincidence. This was the product of a tactical philosophy so alien to American military doctrine that Pentagon analysts would spend decades trying to understand it. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment operated by rules that seemed primitive to the firepower-obsessed Americans. They moved like predators, thought like hunters, and fought with a cold efficiency that disturbed even their allies. But the raid itself was only the visible fraction of something far more unsettling. The Viet Cong had a name for these Australians, Ma Rung, the Phantoms of the Jungle. And on that steaming morning in Phuoc Tuy Province in 1967, the Americans finally understood why the enemy whispered that name with genuine terror. Behind that 2-minute assault lay years of tactical evolution, controversial methods that violated every rule of conventional warfare, and a kill ratio so impossibly high that the Pentagon initially suspected the Australians were falsifying their reports. They were not falsifying anything. The truth was far more disturbing than any fabrication could be, and the Americans were about to discover just how deep the rabbit hole went. The story of how 12 sheep farmers, factory workers, and surfboard riders from the sunburned continent became the most feared special operators in Southeast Asia begins not in the jungle, but in the red dust of the Australian outback. It begins with lessons learned from Aboriginal trackers who had hunted across that ancient land for 40,000 years. It begins with a military philosophy forged in the crucible of Malaya and Borneo, where Australian soldiers learned that the jungle was not an enemy to be conquered, but an ally to be embraced. The Americans never wanted this story told. The Australians were too modest to tell it themselves, but the facts remained buried in classified after-action reports, in the traumatized memories of Viet Cong survivors, and in the reluctant admiration of U.S. Special Forces operators who witnessed Australian methods firsthand. What those reports contained would shake the foundations of American military confidence. The year was 1966 when the first Australian SAS squadron arrived at Nui Dat, a dusty firebase carved out of the rubber plantations in Phuoc Tuy Province. The Americans barely noticed them. Why would they? Australia had committed only a small task force to Vietnam, a token contribution from a minor ally. The real war, everyone knew, would be won by American firepower, by B-52 carpet bombing, by helicopter gunships raining death from above, by the sheer, overwhelming industrial might of the United States military machine. The Australians said nothing. They simply unpacked their gear and began doing things differently. But different did not begin to describe what the Americans were about to witness. The first American advisors to work with the Australian SAS reported back with confusion bordering on alarm. These Australians refused helicopters for insertion whenever possible, preferring to walk into their operational areas over several days. They carried minimal ammunition but maximum water. They communicated through hand signals for hours on end, sometimes not speaking a single word for 3 or 4 days straight. They did not wear helmets because helmets made noise. They did not wear standard issue boots because standard issue boots left predictable tracks. They taped down every piece of equipment that could rattle or clink. They blackened their faces not just with camouflage paint, but with charcoal that would not reflect moonlight. American observers called it excessive, paranoid, overcautious. The Australians called it survival, and they were about to prove exactly why. The first patrol reports began trickling back to American intelligence officers, and the numbers made no sense whatsoever. A 4-man Australian SAS team had spent 11 days in the jungle, located 3 separate Viet Cong supply routes, called in artillery strikes that eliminated an estimated 200 enemy combatants, and returned without a single casualty. Not a scratch, not even a minor wound. The Americans sent 12-man teams for 3-day missions and considered 50% casualties acceptable. Something was very wrong with these numbers, or something was very right. The Pentagon demanded verification. Surely the Australians were exaggerating. Surely these reports were propaganda designed to make the Commonwealth contribution look more significant than it actually was. American analysts reviewed the evidence expecting to find fabrication. What they found instead kept them awake at night. The tactical philosophy that made Australian SAS so devastatingly effective can be summarized in a single word that the Americans never truly understood: patience. While American doctrine emphasized aggressive contact, the Australians specialized in avoidance. While American patrols crashed through the jungle seeking the enemy, Australian patrols became invisible, watching and waiting until they possessed complete tactical superiority. The Americans fought the jungle. The Australians became the jungle. This was not metaphor. This was not poetic exaggeration. This was literal methodology that took years to develop and perfect, and the training required to achieve it bordered on the inhuman. Australian SAS operators spent months mastering the art of stillness. They could remain motionless for 8, 10, 12 hours while enemy patrols passed within meters of their position. They controlled their breathing to minimize chest movement. They trained their eyes to scan without moving their heads. They learned to suppress the cough reflex, the sneeze reflex, the automatic swatting motion when insects crawled across exposed skin. One former operator later described it as learning to become a rock that thinks. But stillness was merely the foundation. What came next was far more disturbing. The Viet Cong were masters of the jungle. They had lived in it their entire lives. They knew every trail, every stream, every hiding spot. Against the Americans, this gave them enormous advantage. They could hear the U.S. patrols coming from kilometers away, the crashing footsteps, the rattling equipment, the helicopter rotors announcing every insertion. They simply melted into the green and waited for the noisy Americans to pass. Against the Australians, this advantage evaporated completely. The Viet Cong could not hear the Australian patrols. They could not see them. They could not smell them because the Australians did not use soap, insect repellent, or any scented product for days before patrol. The first indication that Australian SAS was present usually came in the form of a precisely aimed bullet or a silent knife across the throat. By the time the Viet Cong realized they were being hunted, it was already too late. But patience was only the first element of Australian superiority. The second element was far more controversial. And when the Americans finally learned about it, some of them refused to believe what they were hearing. The Americans learned about the cut boots in 1967, and the discovery sent shockwaves through the intelligence community. An American liaison officer embedded with an Australian patrol noticed something strange about the footwear the Australians carried in their packs. Extra boots, but not normal boots. These boots had been carefully modified with unusual tread patterns. Some had the soles reversed. Others had entirely different patterns cut into the rubber. A few appeared to be sandals designed to mimic Vietnamese footwear. When the American asked about this, the Australian patrol leader simply smiled and said nothing. The truth emerged slowly through prisoner interrogations and captured enemy documents. And the truth was remarkable. The Viet Cong had become utterly paranoid about Australian patrols because they could never tell where the Australians had been. Normal military boots leave distinctive tracks. American patrols could be tracked by their footprints for days, but Australian SAS rotated through different footwear during their patrols, sometimes changing boots multiple times per day, leaving a confusing jumble of tracks that suggested random civilian traffic rather than military movement. Some Australian operators went even further. They would walk backward for hundreds of meters, leaving tracks that appeared to show a patrol moving in the opposite direction. They would split their team and have members walk in each other's footsteps to mask their numbers. They would cross streams multiple times, enter and exit at different points, create false trails leading to ambush sites. The jungle floor became a canvas for tactical deception of the highest order. And the Viet Cong trackers were losing their minds trying to understand it. The Viet Cong employed some of the best trackers in the world. Men who had learned their craft from childhood. Men who could follow a trail through terrain that Western eyes saw as trackless wilderness. Against American patrols, these trackers were devastatingly effective. They could determine patrol size, direction, speed, and even the physical condition of individual soldiers from the marks they left behind. Against Australian SAS, these master trackers reported something unprecedented. They told their commanders that hunting Australian patrols was like chasing ghosts. The tracks appeared, disappeared, multiplied, divided, and led nowhere. Several Viet Cong tracking teams were themselves ambushed while following false trails carefully laid by Australian operators who had doubled back to hunt their hunters. The predator had become the prey, and the psychological impact was devastating. But the boot deception was merely one technique among dozens. What the Americans discovered next made the cut boot seem almost quaint by comparison. The Aboriginal influence on Australian SAS tactics remains one of the most fascinating and least discussed aspects of their Vietnam success. When the Australian military began developing its special forces capability in the 1950s, they made a decision that would prove crucial decades later. They recruited Aboriginal trackers as instructors and integrated indigenous hunting techniques into their training curriculum. These were not primitive methods romanticized by Western observers. These were sophisticated environmental reading skills developed over millennia by people who had survived in one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. And those skills translated to the Vietnamese jungle with terrifying effectiveness. Aboriginal trackers could determine how many people had passed a location, how long ago, whether they were carrying heavy loads, whether they were moving quickly or slowly, whether they were healthy or injured. They could read these stories in bent grass, disturbed soil, broken spiderwebs, and altered insect behavior. They could track a man across stone if they had to. Australian SAS operators spent months learning these techniques before deployment to Vietnam. They learned to see the jungle not as a chaotic mass of vegetation, but as an information-rich environment where every disturbed leaf told a story. They learned tracking methods that the Viet Cong, despite their jungle expertise, had never encountered. The result was a predator-prey dynamic that inverted every normal expectation of guerrilla warfare. The Viet Cong had always been the hunters in this jungle. They used their intimate knowledge of the terrain to stalk and ambush foreign invaders. This was their war, their land, their element. They had defeated the French using these methods. They were defeating the Americans using these methods. Against the Australians, they became the hunted, and they did not know how to cope with this reversal. Australian patrols would locate enemy camps, observe them for days to determine patterns and strength, and then either call in precision strikes or execute their own surgical assaults. The Viet Cong never knew they were being watched until the moment of destruction arrived. American commanders who reviewed Australian patrol reports noticed a disturbing pattern. The Australians seemed to know exactly where the enemy would be before the enemy arrived. They seemed to predict movement patterns with uncanny accuracy. Some American officers privately suspected the Australians had intelligence sources they were not sharing, perhaps signals intercepts, perhaps human intelligence networks. Perhaps some classified capability that Allied security protocols prevented them from discussing. The truth was simpler, and far more remarkable. The Australians were simply better at reading the jungle. They did not need spy satellites or code breakers. They had learned to see what others could not see. And that made them more dangerous than any technological advantage could have achieved. But tactical superiority was only half of the Australian approach. The psychological dimension proved equally important, and far more controversial. The Viet Cong feared the Americans for their firepower, the thunder of artillery, the shriek of jet aircraft, the churning rotors of helicopter gunships. American military might was terrifying in its scale and destructive capacity. But it was a terror that could be endured because it was predictable. You heard the helicopters coming. You saw the artillery flashes. You knew when to hide and when to run. The Viet Cong feared the Australians for something else entirely, something worse than firepower. They feared the knowledge that death could come silently, without warning, from an enemy who might be watching at any moment. The Australians understood that in guerrilla warfare, psychology was as important as bullets. A terrified enemy makes mistakes. An enemy who cannot sleep, who jumps at every shadow, who suspects every trail and distrusts every tree line, has already lost half the battle before contact is made. American strategy relied on demonstrating overwhelming force. Australian strategy relied on demonstrating omnipresent threat, and the methods used to achieve this psychological dominance remain controversial to this day. Some Australian psychological warfare tactics have been confirmed through official records. Australian patrols would sometimes leave evidence of their presence deliberately. A single footprint where none should exist. A bit of equipment seemingly dropped by accident. Signs that the phantoms had been watching. Viet Cong documents captured after the war revealed that some units refused to operate in areas known to be patrolled by Australian SAS. They preferred to face American firepower rather than the terrifying uncertainty of Australian methods. Better the devil you could see than the devil you could not. Other reported methods have never been officially confirmed and remain the subject of heated debate among military historians. What is certain is that the Viet Cong developed specific protocols for Australian SAS encounters that differed significantly from their American engagement procedures. The difference was stark and revealing. Against Americans, Viet Cong units would often stand and fight if the tactical situation favored them. They had learned through experience that American patrols could be ambushed, American positions could be overrun, American firepower could be evaded through proper use of terrain and timing. Against Australians, standard operating procedure was immediate withdrawal regardless of numerical advantage. Do not engage. Do not pursue. Do not attempt to track. Simply leave the area and report the contact to higher command. Better to lose the position than to engage an enemy you could not see, could not track, and could not predict. This was fear at the institutional level, and the Australians cultivated it deliberately. The psychological impact extended far beyond immediate tactical encounters. Viet Cong morale reports from Phuoc Tuy Province, the Australian area of operations, showed measurable decline after 1966. Recruitment became more difficult. Desertions increased. Local villagers who might have supported the insurgency became reluctant to do so. The reason was simple. Australian patrols seemed to be everywhere, watching everything, knowing everyone who moved through the jungle. A villager who stored weapons for the Viet Cong might wake up to find that his cache had been discovered and destroyed without any sign of who had done it. A supply courier who thought his route was secure would simply vanish, never to be seen again. This was counterinsurgency at its most effective, not through hearts and minds programs, not through overwhelming military force, but through the systematic creation of uncertainty and fear in the enemy population, and the Americans had no idea how to replicate it. But all of these methods were merely preparation for the main event, the 122nd raid that would leave American observers questioning everything they thought they knew about special operations. The target was identified through weeks of patient surveillance. A Viet Cong supply depot hidden in the jungle approximately 15 kilometers from the nearest friendly position. Australian patrols had spent over 2 weeks rotating through observation positions, mapping the exact layout of the facility, counting personnel, determining rotation schedules, identifying defensive positions, and planning approach and withdrawal routes. The depot contained weapons, ammunition, rice, medical supplies, and documents. It served as a crucial node in the Viet Cong logistics network, supporting operations throughout Phuoc Tuy Province. Destroying it would cripple enemy capability for months. The Americans would have called in an airstrike, B-52s carpet bombing the entire grid square, or artillery, hundreds of rounds saturating the target area, or a helicopter assault with a company-sized element fast roping into a hot landing zone. The Australians proposed something different, a direct action mission with 12 operators. The American advisors thought they had misheard. 12 men against a fortified position, containing 40 to 50 enemy combatants. They had not misheard. And what the Australians explained next defied everything the Americans thought they knew about military planning. The assault would occur at precisely 0300 hours, the deepest point of the human sleep cycle, when alertness and reaction time are at their lowest ebb. The 12 operators would approach from 4 different directions simultaneously, having pre-positioned themselves over the preceding 36 hours. 36 hours, lying motionless in the jungle, waiting for the perfect moment, while enemy patrols walked within meters of their concealed positions. Each operator had specific assigned targets and firing lanes. The assault would last no more than 2 minutes because 2 minutes was all they would need. Every shot would be aimed. Every movement would be purposeful. Every second would be choreographed like a lethal ballet. There would be no extraction helicopters waiting, no quick reaction force standing by, no artillery on call for emergency support. The Australians would walk out the same way they had walked in, through 10 kilometers of jungle that the Viet Cong thought they controlled. If the assault went wrong, there was no backup plan. Just 12 men against the jungle, and whoever survived the initial contact. The American advisors raised every objection they could think of. The force ratio was suicidal. The approach was tactically unsound. The lack of supporting fires violated every principle of military planning. No competent commander would approve such a mission. The Australian patrol leader listened patiently to each objection. Then he explained that Australian commanders had already approved the mission, that similar operations had been conducted successfully throughout their deployment, that the plan was not reckless, but precisely calculated based on methods the Americans did not fully understand. The Americans could watch if they wanted, but they would not interfere. And so the Americans watched. What they saw would haunt them for the rest of their careers. The night was moonless and thick with humidity. The American advisors had positioned themselves on a ridge overlooking the target area, equipped with early-generation night observation devices that rendered the jungle in ghostly shades of green. They had been in position for 6 hours, barely moving, fighting cramps and insects, and the overwhelming urge to shift position. Somewhere in the darkness below, 12 Australian operators were completing their final approach to assault positions. The Americans could see nothing. No movement, no shadows. No indication that any human being occupied the jungle between their ridge and the enemy depot. The Viet Cong sentries saw nothing either. They walked their posts with the casual alertness of men who believed themselves secure. The depot had operated from this location for over a year without incident. American patrols never came this deep into the jungle. The nearest helicopter landing zone was kilometers away. They had nothing to fear except the usual hazards of life in the resistance. At 0258, one of the American advisors noticed a flicker of movement at the edge of the depot perimeter. He blinked, looked again, saw nothing. Probably imagination. The jungle played tricks on tired eyes. At 0259, he noticed another flicker, closer to the main structures this time. Again, nothing visible when he focused directly. At exactly 0300, the night exploded. 12 weapons opened fire simultaneously from 4 directions. There was no warning volley, no calls to surrender, no illumination rounds revealing the assault force. Just the sudden concentrated application of lethal force from sources the defenders could not see. The Australians had positioned themselves to create interlocking fields of fire that covered every possible escape route. Viet Cong fighters who emerged from their sleeping positions ran directly into pre-aimed weapons. Those who tried to reach defensive positions found them already compromised. Those who attempted to flee into the jungle encountered operators positioned specifically to intercept runners. The American observers watched through their night vision devices with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The assault was not chaotic. It was mechanical, precise. Every shot seemed to find a target. Every movement flowed into the next movement. The Australians were not fighting. They were executing a drill they had rehearsed 1,000 times. 30 seconds into the assault, half the enemy combatants were down. 45 seconds, the organized resistance had collapsed. 60 seconds, the survivors were fleeing in panic, running directly into the ambush positions the Australians had established for exactly this purpose. 90 seconds into the assault, the shooting stopped. The Australians had expended their initial magazines and were conducting rapid assessments while reloading. The silence was almost more shocking than the violence had been. Then, 30 seconds later, the final phase began. A systematic sweep of the facility, confirmation of eliminated threats, collection of intelligence materials, destruction of supplies that could not be carried. By the 2-minute mark, it was over. 43 Viet Cong combatants eliminated. The supply depot destroyed. Australian casualties were 0. Not a single operator wounded. Not even a near miss reported. The Australians collected what documents and materials they could carry and vanished into the jungle. By dawn, they were 8 kilometers away. By nightfall, they had reached their extraction point. The Viet Cong reinforcements who arrived at the destroyed depot found nothing to pursue, no tracks to follow, no trail to hunt, just devastation and silence. And the Americans on that ridge began the long process of understanding what they had just witnessed. The reports filed by the American advisors traveled through official channels to Saigon to Pacific Command, eventually to the Pentagon itself. The response was not celebration of Allied success. It was concern. How had the Australians achieved results that American special forces could not replicate? What methods were they using? And most troubling of all, why had nobody told us about this? The investigation that followed produced findings that the Pentagon found deeply uncomfortable. Australian SAS was not merely performing well in Vietnam. They were performing at levels that made equivalent American units look incompetent by comparison. The kill ratio numbers were the most damning evidence of all. American Special Forces achieved approximately 1.5 enemy eliminations per friendly casualty. This was considered acceptable performance for counterinsurgency operations. War was bloody. Casualties were inevitable. The enemy was skilled and determined. Australian SAS achieved approximately 50 enemy eliminations per friendly casualty. This was not a marginal improvement. This was not a statistical anomaly. This was an order of magnitude difference that defied everything American military planners thought they understood about jungle warfare. How was this possible? The Australians did not have better equipment. They did not have better intelligence support. They did not have better air cover or artillery or logistics. By every measurable metric of military capability, the Americans should have been superior, but they were not. And the explanation for this failure cut to the heart of American military culture. The Americans were not worse soldiers in any meaningful sense. Their training was rigorous. Their courage was beyond question. Their dedication to mission accomplishment was total. The problem was not the soldiers. The problem was the doctrine they had been trained to follow. American military thinking was designed for conventional conflict, mass and firepower as the solution to every tactical problem. Find the enemy, fix the enemy in place, destroy the enemy with overwhelming force. This approach had won World War II. It had won Korea. It was the American way of war. In Vietnam, it was failing catastrophically. The Viet Cong refused to present themselves for destruction. They melted away before American firepower and re-emerged after the destruction had passed. The massive bombing campaigns killed thousands, but failed to break enemy will or capability. The search and destroy missions swept through jungle that was empty by the time American boots hit the ground. The Australians had learned different lessons in different wars. In Malaya and Borneo, they had fought insurgencies where conventional methods were equally useless. They had developed tactics specifically suited to jungle counterinsurgency, small units, extended patrols, patience and observation rather than aggression and firepower. They arrived in Vietnam already adapted to the war they would fight. The Americans were still trying to adapt, still believing that more firepower and more troops would eventually produce victory. The 122nd raid was not an anomaly. It was the natural result of a tactical philosophy that the Americans had never bothered to study, and by the time they realized their mistake, it was too late to change course. The rivalry between Australian and American special forces in Vietnam has never been officially acknowledged. No Pentagon press release ever admitted that Commonwealth allies had outperformed American elite units. No official history discussed the uncomfortable kill ratio comparisons or the tactical innovations that the Americans failed to adopt. But the evidence of that rivalry appears throughout classified records and veteran accounts. American Green Beret and Navy SEAL operators who worked alongside Australians reported a complex mixture of admiration, resentment, and disbelief. The Australians did things that American doctrine said were impossible. They achieved results that American commanders could not explain. And they did it all with a casual competence that made the Americans feel like novices learning their craft. One American operator later described his first patrol with an Australian SAS team as the most humiliating experience of his military career. He had considered himself elite, the top of the Special Forces pyramid, years of training, multiple deployments, combat experience that had tested and proven his capabilities. Within hours of joining the Australian patrol, they had made him feel like a liability. He was too loud. His footsteps crashed through vegetation that the Australians parted silently. He moved too fast, creating noise and leaving tracks. He carried too much ammunition and not enough water. He wanted to engage every enemy contact while the Australians wanted to observe, report, and let artillery do the hard work. By the end of that patrol, his entire understanding of jungle warfare had been inverted. The methods he had been taught, the aggressive search and destroy tactics that American Special Forces prided themselves on, were revealed as fundamentally flawed for this environment. The Australians were not being overcautious. They were being efficient. They understood something that the Americans had not yet grasped. In guerrilla warfare, the side that sees without being seen has already won. Some American operators requested transfer to Australian units. Most of these requests were denied for administrative reasons. Allied forces operated under different command structures. Personnel exchanges required paperwork and approvals that bureaucracies were reluctant to provide. A few requests were approved, and the Americans who served with Australian SAS returned to their own units forever changed. They tried to implement Australian methods. With limited success, American military culture resisted. The aggressive, firepower-oriented approach was too deeply embedded. Telling American commanders to be patient, to avoid contact, to let the enemy come to you rather than charging after him, was like telling water to flow uphill. The institutional momentum was overwhelming. Careers were built on body counts and aggressive action. Medals were awarded for valor under fire, not for patience and observation. The entire reward structure of the American military incentivized exactly the behaviors that made their forces less effective in counterinsurgency. The Australians watched this resistance with a mixture of frustration and resignation. They knew their methods worked. The results proved it beyond any reasonable doubt. But they also knew that the Americans would have to learn these lessons the hard way, through blood and failure rather than observation and adaptation, and so the opportunity was lost. The lessons that could have transformed American performance remained unlearned. The war continued to be fought the American way, with American casualties mounting month after month. The Pentagon reports on Australian SAS effectiveness were classified for decades. When they were finally declassified, they received almost no attention. The American narrative of Vietnam was already established. It was a story of American sacrifice and eventual withdrawal, of political failure rather than military inadequacy. There was no room in this narrative for the uncomfortable truth that a handful of Australians had shown how the war might have been fought differently. The statistics remained buried in archives, the kill ratio comparisons, the casualty differentials, the tactical assessments that concluded Australian methods were superior in virtually every measurable dimension. If American forces had achieved Australian levels of effectiveness, the numbers would have been transformed. Thousands of American lives potentially saved. Hundreds of thousands of enemy combatants neutralized rather than allowed to continue fighting. Of course, such counterfactuals are impossible to verify. The Australians operated in a limited area of responsibility. Their methods might not have scaled to the entire American effort. Their small unit tactics might have been impossible to replicate across a military force of 500,000 personnel. All of this is true, but it is also true that the American military establishment showed remarkably little interest in learning from Australian success. The reports were filed. The lessons went unlearned. And the war ground on. The Australian operators themselves returned home to a country that wanted to forget Vietnam ever happened. Unlike the Americans, who at least eventually recognized their veterans with memorials and ceremonies, Australia buried its Vietnam experience under layers of political shame. The anti-war movement had been fierce. Public opinion had turned against the conflict. Veterans returned to hostility or indifference rather than appreciation. Many were advised not to wear their uniforms in public. Some were spat upon by protesters who blamed the soldiers for the policies of politicians. The SAS operators in particular found themselves in an impossible position. Their methods, though devastatingly effective, included elements that could not be publicly discussed. The psychological warfare tactics, the pre-dawn raids, the interrogation techniques that produced actionable intelligence. All of this was necessary for operational success, and all of it was politically radioactive in peacetime Australia. So they said nothing. The greatest special forces success story of the Vietnam War went untold. The men who had earned the respect of their American counterparts, who had terrorized the Viet Cong, who had demonstrated tactical innovation that Pentagon analysts could not explain, came home and resumed ordinary lives. Factory jobs, farming, small businesses. Many struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress. The transition from apex predator to suburban civilian was not easily made. They had learned to see the world as a hunting ground, to read every environment for threat and opportunity, to operate at levels of alertness that civilian life did not require. The silence suited everyone. The Australian government did not want to discuss Vietnam at all. The American military did not want to acknowledge that their methods had been inferior. The veterans themselves could not explain what they had done to people who had not been there. The conspiracy of silence held for decades, but the influence of Australian SAS methods did not entirely disappear. In the classified world of special operations development, Australian techniques were quietly studied and adapted. The tracker training programs that became standard for American Special Forces in the 1980s bore suspicious resemblance to Australian methods. The emphasis on pre-deployment environmental adaptation mirrored Australian practices. The shift away from large unit direct action towards small team reconnaissance and precision strike reflected lessons that Australians had demonstrated decades earlier. Nobody acknowledged where these innovations came from. The institutional pride of the American military prevented such admissions, but the influence was unmistakable to anyone who had studied both systems. When American Special Forces achieved their remarkable successes in Afghanistan in 2001, operating in small teams, adapting to local conditions, emphasizing patience and observation over brute force, military historians noted echoes of an earlier conflict. The lessons of Vietnam had finally been learned, even if nobody wanted to credit where those lessons originally came from. The controversy surrounding Australian SAS methods has grown rather than diminished with time. As documents have been declassified and veterans have begun speaking about their experiences, uncomfortable questions have emerged. How far did psychological warfare tactics extend? What happened during those interrogations that produced such valuable intelligence? How many of the methods used would have constituted violations of the Geneva Conventions under strict interpretation? These questions have no easy answers. The veterans who participated generally refuse to discuss specifics even now. The official records are either incomplete or still classified. What remains clear is that the Australian SAS achieved extraordinary results through methods that differed dramatically from conventional warfare. Whether those methods can be morally justified depends on positions about the ethics of warfare that reasonable people continue to debate. Some argue that war is inherently brutal, and that soldiers who reduce overall casualties through effective but harsh methods deserve praise rather than condemnation. The Australians eliminated enemy combatants with minimal friendly casualties and minimal collateral damage to civilian populations. Compared to the massive bombing campaigns that Americans favored, Australian methods might actually have been more humane in their overall effects. Others argue that certain methods cannot be justified regardless of their effectiveness. If Australian operators engaged in practices that violated international law, the success of those practices does not excuse them. The debate continues. And the Australian SAS Vietnam veterans watch it with mixed feelings. They know what they did. They know why they did it. They know the cost they have paid in sleepless nights and relationships destroyed and lives struggling to find meaning after the intensity of combat. They do not expect civilians to understand. They simply ask that the sacrifices they made and the successes they achieved receive some recognition amid all the moral philosophizing. The 122nd Raid remains a defining moment in Special Forces history, even if most people have never heard of it. 12 men against 43. 0 friendly casualties against total enemy elimination. A level of tactical perfection that American Special Forces have spent decades trying to replicate. The operation has been studied at war colleges around the world as an example of what small unit direct action can achieve when planning, patience, and execution align perfectly. The American advisors who witnessed the raid went on to distinguished military careers. Several rose to senior command positions. In private conversations, they would occasionally mention that morning in 1967 when they watched the Australians work. They would describe the eerie silence before the assault, the sudden coordinated violence, the equally sudden silence that followed. They would admit that in that moment they realized everything they thought they knew about special operations needed to be reconsidered. One of those advisors, who eventually reached general officer rank, was asked late in his career what the most important lesson of Vietnam was. His answer surprised the interviewer. He said that the most important lesson was that the Americans had been too arrogant to learn from their allies. They had assumed that American methods were best because American methods were American. They had ignored evidence that other approaches might be more effective, and they had paid for that arrogance in ways that still haunted the nation. The Australian SAS commitment to Vietnam ended in 1971 as Australia followed the Americans in withdrawal. By then, the unit had conducted over 1,200 patrols in Phuoc Tuy Province. They had eliminated an estimated 500 enemy combatants through direct contact alone, with countless more accounted for through called artillery and airstrikes. They had gathered intelligence that shaped the entire Allied understanding of Viet Cong operations in the region. Their casualties were remarkably light. 2 operators lost through hostile action during the entire deployment. Several more wounded, though none permanently disabled. The ratio of success to sacrifice was unprecedented in the history of the Vietnam conflict. No other unit on either side achieved comparable results with such minimal losses. The Viet Cong survivors who were interviewed after the war spoke of the Ma Rung with something approaching superstitious dread. They described them as men who were not quite human, who moved through the jungle like spirits, who seemed to know where the Viet Cong were before the Viet Cong knew themselves. One former political officer said that the Australian patrols were more damaging to morale than all the American bombing combined. Because you could hide from bombs, you could hear them coming, you could dig shelters and wait for the destruction to pass, but you could not hide from ghosts. This was the legacy of the Australian SAS in Vietnam. Not the massive operations that dominated American strategy, but a constant quiet presence that made the enemy afraid to move. Not shock and awe, but persistent invisible threat. Not the destruction of armies, but the psychological degradation of individuals one patrol at a time. The story deserves to be told not because it glorifies war, but because it illuminates aspects of the conflict that the official narrative has obscured. The Americans did not lose Vietnam because they lacked courage or firepower or commitment. They lost because they applied conventional military thinking to an unconventional conflict. The Australians succeeded not because they were better soldiers in some abstract sense, but because they understood the specific nature of the war they were fighting. This distinction matters because the same mistakes have been repeated in subsequent conflicts. Afghanistan and Iraq saw American forces initially applying overwhelming firepower to problems that required patience and cultural understanding. The lessons that Australian SAS demonstrated in Vietnam had to be relearned at tremendous cost. How many lives might have been saved if the 1967 reports on Australian effectiveness had been studied rather than classified and forgotten? The 12 operators who conducted the 122nd raid have never been publicly identified. Military necessity required anonymity during their service, and personal preference has maintained it since. They are now elderly men, if they are still living, their children and grandchildren likely unaware of what their fathers and grandfathers accomplished in that distant jungle. The medals they earned for that operation and others are tucked away in drawers, occasionally taken out and examined, never displayed or discussed. This is perhaps how they would want it. The Australian SAS culture never valued publicity. They did their jobs, achieved their objectives, and went home. They did not seek recognition because recognition was not why they served. They served because they were asked to. Because they believed in their country and their mates. Because they possessed skills that could make a difference in a war that most people would have preferred to forget. The final assessment of Australian SAS effectiveness in Vietnam comes not from Allied reports, but from enemy testimony. Captured documents revealed that Viet Cong High Command issued specific orders regarding Australian patrols that differed from all other Allied forces. Units encountering suspected Australian presence were to withdraw immediately and report rather than engage. Heavy weapons and experienced fighters were to be concentrated in areas known to be patrolled by Australian SAS. Specific bounties were placed on Australian operators higher than those offered for American personnel of equivalent rank. The Viet Cong did not offer these bounties out of abstract respect. They offered them because they wanted the Australian patrols stopped, and normal means had failed to achieve this. Every technique that worked against American forces proved ineffective against the Australians. The traps, the ambushes, the intelligence networks, all of it was neutralized by operators who had learned to see what others could not see and move where others could not move. One captured Viet Cong commander, interrogated after the war, was asked which enemy forces he feared most. His answer was immediate and unequivocal. Not the American Marines with their fearsome reputation, not the Army Special Forces with their unconventional capabilities. The Australian Phantoms, because you never knew where they were. You never knew when they were watching. You could be sitting in a camp that you believed was secure and discover the next morning that they had been there, had counted your men, had mapped your positions, and had chosen to let you live only because eliminating you that night was not operationally necessary. That knowledge, he said, was worse than anything. The certainty that at any moment, from any direction, with no warning whatsoever, the end could come. The Americans you could hear coming. You could prepare. You could fight or flee with some reasonable expectation of survival. The Australians offered no such opportunity. They were simply there, invisible and omnipresent. And when they decided you would not see another sunrise, there was nothing you could do about it. The tactical innovations that Australian SAS developed in Vietnam continue to influence special operations to this day. The emphasis on extended patrol duration, on minimal signature movement, on environmental reading skills, on psychological warfare through demonstrated omnipresence. All of these concepts have been incorporated into modern doctrine, even when their Australian origins go unacknowledged. Contemporary Special Forces training now routinely includes elements that would have been familiar to the men who conducted the 122nd raid. Tracker training, silent movement drills, extended observation exercises, Psychological operations, integration. The specific techniques have evolved with technology, but the underlying philosophy remains unchanged. Small units of highly skilled operators can achieve effects disproportionate to their numbers if they are properly trained, intelligently employed, and allowed to fight according to methods suited to the operational environment. This was the lesson of Australian SAS in Vietnam. Not that courage alone could win, but that adaptation could. Not that firepower was irrelevant, but that it was not sufficient. Not that American special forces were inferior, but that their methods were inappropriately applied. The 12 men who materialized from the jungle that morning in 1967 did not succeed because they were superhuman. They succeeded because they understood their environment, their enemy, and themselves in ways that their allies did not yet comprehend. The 120 seconds of that raid represented the culmination of years of institutional learning. The selection processes that identified men capable of extraordinary patience and stress tolerance. The training pipelines that transformed farmers and factory workers into silent jungle predators. The doctrinal evolution that valued intelligence over aggression and precision over volume. The leadership culture that trusted small units to operate independently for days or weeks without supervision. All of this came together in 2 minutes of perfectly executed violence. And when it was over, when the Australians vanished back into the jungle that had become their element, they left behind not just a destroyed enemy position, but a demonstration of what special forces could achieve when everything aligned correctly. The Americans who witnessed the raid returned to their units with stories that most of their colleagues did not believe. 12 men against 43 with no casualties. A 2-minute assault on a fortified position. Silent approach through jungle that American patrols considered impassable. It sounded like propaganda. It sounded like the kind of story that allies exaggerate to make themselves look good. But the evidence was undeniable. The destroyed depot existed. The eliminated combatants could be counted. The American advisors had watched through night vision equipment as the assault unfolded. They had seen what they had seen. And what they had seen changed their understanding of what was possible. Some of those Americans requested permission to study Australian methods formally. Most of these requests were denied. The institutional barriers between Allied forces, the bureaucratic complications of cross-training programs, the simple professional jealousy that made senior officers reluctant to admit their methods might be inferior. All of these factors combined to prevent systematic knowledge transfer. A few determined individuals pursued informal learning anyway. They cultivated relationships with Australian operators. They volunteered for joint missions whenever possible. They took detailed notes on Australian procedures and tried to implement them in their own units. Some succeeded partially. Most faced resistance from American military culture that remained committed to its own approach regardless of evidence. The irony remains painful. The lessons that could have transformed American performance in Vietnam were available. Allied forces were demonstrating superior methods in the same theater of operations. All that was required was the humility to acknowledge that someone else might know better, and the institutional flexibility to adapt. Neither quality was present in sufficient supply, and so the opportunity was lost. Decades later, the legacy of Australian SAS in Vietnam remains contested and incomplete. The official histories acknowledge their presence, but often minimize their significance. The popular culture depictions of Vietnam focus almost exclusively on American experience. The tactical innovations they demonstrated have been absorbed into modern doctrine without attribution. The men themselves have largely passed from public memory, their contributions known only to specialists and enthusiasts. But for those who know the full story, the 122nd raid stands as a testament to what human capability can achieve. Not through superior technology or overwhelming resources, but through superior adaptation and execution. 12 men from a country of 12 million demonstrated that the mightiest military power on Earth was fighting the wrong war with the wrong methods. They showed what might have been possible if American commanders had been willing to learn. The American advisors who reported that morning eventually retired from military service. Most never forgot what they witnessed. In their memoirs and oral histories, the raid appears as a pivotal moment, a before and after point in their understanding of special operations. Before, they believed American methods were best. After, they knew better. One of them, interviewed shortly before his passing, was asked what message he would send to current Special Forces operators if he could. He thought for a long moment before answering. He said that he would tell them to find the Australians, to learn from them, to set aside the assumption that American methods were automatically superior, to remember that in 1967, a dozen sheep farmers and factory workers accomplished something that the best trained special forces in the world could not replicate. We sent warriors, not men, he said, and they showed us what warriors could do. The jungle has grown back over the sites where Australian SAS conducted their operations. The rubber plantations have been replanted. The villages have been rebuilt. Vietnam has transformed from wartime enemy to trading partner and tourist destination. The war that consumed so many lives and resources has faded into history, studied by academics and remembered by survivors, but increasingly distant from contemporary consciousness. But the lessons remain relevant. The tactical innovations that Australian SAS developed continue to influence how modern special forces train, operate, and think about their missions. The emphasis on adaptation over doctrine, on patience over aggression, on precision over volume. These principles have become standard in special operations communities worldwide. The 12 men who conducted the 122nd raid might not recognize the technology that contemporary operators employ, but they would immediately recognize the philosophy: small units, extensive preparation, environmental integration, psychological dominance, precise execution, minimal signature. These were the principles that made Australian SAS so effective in Vietnam, and they remain the principles that define special operations excellence today. This is the lasting contribution of Australian SAS to military history. Not a battle won or a campaign completed, but a way of thinking about unconventional warfare that transcends any single conflict. The Americans who witnessed the 122nd raid understood this instinctively, even if they struggled to articulate it. They had seen something fundamental about the nature of special operations, something that their own training had not prepared them to understand. The 12 operators who conducted that raid have earned their place in the history of special forces, not through fame or recognition, which they neither sought nor received, but through the demonstration of what dedicated professionals can achieve when preparation meets opportunity. In 120 seconds, they rewrote the expectations of what was possible. In the decades since, their example has shaped how special forces around the world understand their craft. This is their legacy, not medals or monuments, but influence, the quiet certainty that what they did mattered, that the methods they developed saved lives and won engagements, that the lessons they demonstrated eventually found their way into doctrine, even if the teachers went unacknowledged. They were warriors in an age when their country wanted to forget that warriors existed. They were professionals in a conflict that their nation wished had never happened. They were, quite simply, the best at what they did. And in 120 seconds, they proved it.